fellow sewing lovers, here's Louisa from Timely Studio, and in this video I'll show you how to sew your own panties. In the past year I've written 2 articles about panty pattern making. One shows how to draft a basic panty pattern and the other how to manipulate the basic panty pattern into different styles. They are both very beginner friendly and a great way to start your journey into pattern making. You can check them out on my website, and I'll also put a link in the description. Now this video is about bringing your own designs to life. We will follow the everyday panty pattern that I showed you in a panty pattern manipulation article. But this video is not so much about this specific pattern. I rather want to show you techniques so you can sew your own designs. So what will we learn today? This video is divided into 2 parts, and in part 1 we will learn how to work with stretch fabrics and how to cut and sew them. And in part 2 we will learn how to apply 3 different forms of elastic: the scalloped edge elastic, the fold over elastic, and the hidden elastic. Before we start to cut or sew anything, you need to make a plan. Just take 10 minutes of time and envision all the steps from the first cut to the final stitches, and then write them down. This will help you avoid common mistakes of forgetting steps or sewing them in the wrong order. So making a plan turns sewing into a pleasant experience. So let's start cutting. You need your pattern, obviously, and a cutting mat. Also a roller cutter, fabric scissors, and pin needles. Roller cutter and cutting mat are not absolutely necessary, but cutting exactly is very important when sewing lingerie, and a roller cutter really helps with that. Since drafting on stretch fabric is really difficult, your paper pattern should include seam allowance, as you can see here, so you can cut directly around your pattern. When cutting mesh or lace fabrics, you can put the pattern underneath the fabric. This helps with the right lace placement and avoiding wrinkles. The fashion fabric for your panty pattern should be a 2-way stretch fabric of your choice, like lycra, jersey, lace, or mesh. The crotch lining should always be from cotton jersey. Here you can see all the pieces for the example panty sewn in this video. To sew this panty we also need a matching standard thread from cotton or polyester, the elastic for the back gathering, and the elastic for the edges. So let's move on to sewing. For sewing stretch fabrics you need a sewing machine that is able to perform these 4 stitches: a straight stitch, a standard zigzag stitch, a 3-point zigzag stitch, and an elastic straight stitch. A lot of older sewing machines don't have the elastic straight stitch. In that case you can replace it with a narrow standard zigzag stitch. And you also need a stretch or jersey needle. Don't underestimate the effect a stretch needle has on your seam pattern. If your sewing machine is skipping stitches when sewing with stretch fabric, you most likely use the wrong kind or size of needle. So try out what works best with your fabric before you start sewing your project. Here you can see the sewing order for the panty we create in this video. If you're sewing your own design, you might have to change it, but I think this sequence is a great starting point. And now we will go through all these steps in detail. We start with the front crotch seam between the front part and the crotch part. In the upper left corner you see a diagram showing which stitch I am using. So pin the pieces together and then sew them, taking out your pins before you reach them. Use your sewing foot as a guide for your seam allowance. That's why the exact calving we did before is so important. Guide the fabric with your hands, but let the feeder do the work of transporting the fabric. Also, don't ever stretch the fabric while sewing, because your seam will look ugly and wrinkly afterwards. Just use your hands to make sure that your fabric doesn't slip away and you don't sew in any wrinkles. Now we moved on to the back seam between the 2 back parts. The process of sewing the seam is exactly the same as the front crotch seam. Make sure you're sewing slowly enough so you don't make any mistakes. This video is at 4 times the original speed, so in reality I'm sewing much slower than you see here. Now we'll do the gathering at the back. Fold open the back parts and the seam allowance and lay the elastic on the seam you've just sewn. Secure the elastic with a few stitches. Then use your right hand to pull the elastic almost to its full extension. Use your left hand to guide the fabric. Make sure you only stretch the elastic and not the fabric while sewing. After sewing, the elastic will tighten again and you'll have a nice gathering. Now we'll sew the back crotch seam between the crotch part and the back parts. Fold the crotch part and mark the center with a pin. Pin crotch part and back part right side to right side together. Start from the center and carefully fit the counter-rotating curves together. While sewing, make sure that the fabric is flat underneath the foot, so you don't sew in any wrinkles. Also take care not to stretch the fabric. Now we'll add the crotch lining. Mark the center of the lining with a pin and then pin the lining to the other side of the back part than the fashion fabric. So when you fold the lining over, the seam allowance will lay in between the outer crotch piece and the crotch lining. Now sew along the same seam as you did before. You could do this in one step, but I think this way is a lot easier. Now we'll finish the gusset by stitching fashion fabric and lining together. This is to make sure that the layers don't shift when you later be applying the elastics around the edges. Note that I now use the 3-point zigzag instead of the standard zigzag, because this seam will be visible on the outside. And now we have come to our last bit of sewing, that is closing the side seams. Pin them right sides together and then sew them. Again, not stretching the fabric, as I'm sure you already know by now. Here you can see what we've sewn so far. With this, we reached the end of the first part of this tutorial, where we learned how to cut and sew panties. I hope you've enjoyed this so far. In the second part of this tutorial, I'll show you how to apply the 3 different forms of elastic, the scalloped edge elastic, the fold over elastic and the hidden elastic. So, see you in a minute in part 2. Oh, and also don't forget to like this video and to subscribe to my channel if you want to see more videos like this.